police in riot gear trying to maintain order in the streets of London. Thousands of students protesting higher tuition fees and university budget cuts.
The latest action follows a day of protests 2 weeks ago that led to 60 arrests and dozens injured when a riot broke out at Conservative Party headquarters. We'll continue to bring you these latest shots out of London throughout this hour. Incredible video as you see the police trying to contain the crowd there.
Right, so we have that video, and then you remember the protests we had earlier in the week coming out of Ireland in the news earlier this week, and more news this morning. Ireland now announcing the harshest budget measures in its history. Four-year plan of tax hikes and spending cuts to save $20 billion US. And our first guest of the program today sees big problems in the way that Ireland is handling its debt woes. And while he's had it, he says the U.S. is just as bad. There's Peter Schiff, President and Chief Global Strategist with Euro-Pacific Capital, author of How an Economy Grows and Why it Crashes. Peter's in Stamford, Connecticut. Let's start with Ireland, then we'll try to apply what's happening there maybe to the United States a little bit. You believe the Irish went wrong when they bailed out their banks, right?
Yeah, you have to remember, this is where the problem started. When the financial crisis hit, Irish banks were basically insolvent.
Right.
And rather than allowing the losses to hit the private sector where they should have belonged, the government decided to bail them out. And now the problem is the losses are much bigger than they bargained for, and now the Irish people are being forced to pay the bill for very bad political decisions.
They've announced some of those decisions. Say they're going to cut their minimum wage. They're raising the VAT tax. They're raising some of the income taxes. Keep corporate taxes the same, by the way. But they're doing all these things. As you say, the people have to pay for it. Here in the United States, obviously, we bailed out our banks, too. Are the two comparable? I mean, Ireland's such a much smaller country. But you think they're comparable?
Yeah. Well, sure. You have to remember, go think back to the subprime crisis when it first erupted, and our politicians were assuring us that it was confined to subprime. I was on television saying, no, it's not. The problems permeate the entire mortgage market. You're just seeing it in the weakest link first. So we're seeing the problems of sovereign credit in Ireland before we see them in the U.S., but we made the same mistakes. We just did it on a bigger scale. Now, Ireland has two options, though. They don't need this austerity. They would be much better off if they defaulted. I was in Ireland a couple of weeks ago urging the government not to accept this bailout, but to default. But, we have a third option here in the United States. We call it quantitative easing. But that's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. I think our economy is going to suffer worse from quantitative easing, which is another way to default. You default through inflation, than what would be happening in Ireland.
Well, I also want you to explain, why would Ireland have been better off if they defaulted?
Because they wouldn't have to pay this money back. I mean, first of all, they should definitely default on the debt that the Irish government assumed on behalf of the banks, like Anglo-Irish Bank. I mean, and allow the losses. Because why should the public, why should the Irish people have to foot this bill? I want lenders, I want creditors to take a loss. I don't want people to think that loaning to governments is risk-free. No matter how indebted the government becomes, that it will always tax its citizens to pay its debts. When the government borrows too much money, the lenders need to take a haircut here. It shouldn't just be the Irish people that suffer. It should be all the banks around the world that loaned them the money.
So then will one of the other countries default? I mean, will it happen in Portugal? Or, there's just going to be bailout to bailout, though, here, don't you think?
No, that's why I think default is better. It also creates a moral hazard. Now everybody expects a bailout, and now the lenders expect to get bailed out, so they will loan recklessly to governments that shouldn't be borrowing. People say that it will hurt Ireland if they default because it'll ruin their credit rating and the government won't be able to borrow any more money. Well, that's fantastic news for the Irish, because if the Irish government can't go into debt, then it can't spend money, and it can allow the Irish economy to grow.
Just to get back quickly to the first point of the interview, which was that the Irish got into trouble by bailing out their banks. You're saying we shouldn't have bailed out our banks in the beginning either. Now, someone might say, well, you know what? We got most of the money back with interest on the TARP program. That the United States is a much bigger economy, that we can afford to do something like that versus the Irish, where it's cripples them.
The banks that we bailed out are in worse shape now than before the bailout.
But what if we didn't bail them out?
But they're going to fail anyway, because when the Fed tries to unwind its balance sheet, when it tries to, the exit strategy, and interest rates go up, all those banks that we bailed out are going to fail again, and now they're going to need an even bigger bailout than the first time. And you have to look at all the losses that are now on the books of the Federal Reserve. The Fed has got over $1 trillion worth of crap mortgages, toxic mortgages. what are the losses going to be when they have to sell them? We don't know what the losses are. They're not marking them to market. They're not trying to sell. These losses are hidden in the balance sheet of the Fed, but they are real, and the average Americans are going to suffer because I think rather than exiting, we're going to keep on inflating. It's going to be QE3, QE4. We're going to destroy the dollar, and we're going to wipe out the savings and the wages of the middle class.
Peter, thanks. We always appreciate your time, and thanks for starting us off today. Peter Schiff from Stamford, Connecticut.
So is Peter right? Today's one burning question: should we have bailed out our banks in the first place?
Send us an email right now, Dagan and Connell at foxbusiness.com, and we're going to run through some of your emails a little bit later on in the show.
Well, we did get good news on